Welcome to The Criminologist, the podcast dedicated to educating and entertaining our listeners. We bring you subject matter experts from around the world and share the latest and greatest evidence-based practices and interventions to help individuals desist from a life of crime and delinquency. Now, please welcome the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidson.
Hello, and welcome to episode 196 of the Criminologist podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. We are incredibly honored to have a truly remarkable guest, Suzanne Costello, whose unique blend of dance, theater, and community engagement has made a significant stride in the field of arts and in criminal justice and health. Suzanne's journey began 40 years ago, blossoming into a multifaceted career as a professional dancer and artist. Her performances have graced stages across the United States, Mexico, Canada, and Europe, showcasing not only her artistic prowess, but also her deep commitment to using art as a medium for change and healing. As the artistic co-director of the Stuart Pimsleur Dance and Theater Company since its inception in 1980 in New York City, Suzanne has played an instrumental role in the evolution of the company. Her contributions as a founding performer, choreographer, teacher, and rehearsal director have been pivotal. However, it is her role as the director of arts and entertainment in the arts and health programs that truly set her apart. These programs, recognized for their best practices by the National Endowment for the Arts, are testament to her innovative approach to inclusive community engagement. Suzanne's projects are a beacon of creativity and empathy, designed to give voice to those often unheard. Notably, her recent programs have left an undeniable mark on diverse communities. I believe the South Dakota Prison Project engaged men at the Sioux Falls Penitentiary in a groundbreaking initiative, blending performance, writing, and movement to express their stories beyond incarceration. Our Country's Keepers at Walter Reed Military Center and Raising Our Voices in Birmingham provided platforms for military personnel, veterans, and cancer-affected individuals to share their experiences through art. As we delve into this conversation, we look forward to uncovering the depth and breadth of Suzanne Costello's impactful work, exploring how the arts can play a pivotal role in rehabilitation, healing, and giving voice to the voiceless. Her story is not just one of artistic triumph, but of resilience, empathy, and an unwavering belief in the power of the arts to affect real change. Please enjoy my conversation with Suzanne Costello, and I will see you all on the other side. Well, welcome to the Criminologist podcast, Suzanne. So happy that you are able to join us here. And I'm super thrilled to be talking about this topic for a variety of reasons, up to and including the fact that we're both going to be at the World Congress this April talking about our respective projects. But more on that later. Why don't we start out, Suzanne, by you simply introducing yourself to the audience and then just a little bit of contextual background as to your Moving Beyond Bars project, which is absolutely fascinating. So take it away.
Okay, of course. Well, thanks for having me. Well, my background is not in criminal justice or any of those related fields. My background is that I've been an artist in the performing arts for about 40 years. And in that journey, I've been a performer, a choreographer, a director, teacher, facilitator, and toured quite a bit around this country and internationally. But as we've done projects around our performances, we've always been interested in engaging populations that are not reached by the arts. And those have included lots of different populations. Specifically, I've done an enormous amount of work in healthcare, working with healthcare providers. And that work is also spread out into working with veterans and active military, persons that have been impacted by cancer, people experiencing memory loss or Alzheimer's, and then incarcerated populations. And the thing that I guess all of these kind of groups have in common is that they're sort of identified as people who are not engaged in the arts typically and are what are called underserved populations. And the interest to me is not so much that they're underserved or even that they're a cancer survivor or a veteran, but that my sense is that everybody has really interesting stories in their life, and that often we don't hear them. So the commonality between working with all these groups is that I'm very interested in shining light on the stories that haven't been heard. And that has brought me to this project that I call Moving Beyond Bars, working with incarcerated populations. And again, if you remove the label of inmate or prisoner, justice involved individual, whatever the label might be, I'm interested in what's behind the label, who's the person, and really uncovering the humanity in a group of people who I sense, and of course you have much greater experience, but I sense is one of the most discarded populations in our culture, most invisible populations. And in my work with people in prisons is, of course, I think they're terribly interesting and, of course, have really compelling and poignant stories to share.
You're talking about so many of the themes of this podcast, Suzanne, everything you're really touching on, the populations that we service and how they're perceived by the public. Regular listeners of the podcast know that my tagline that I sign off every episode to try to combat that sort of binary us versus them mentality is to remind listeners there's no them, there's only us, and taking this more holistic view of working with justice involved individuals. So I love that you gave some contextual background that you were doing this work, among other things, introducing the arts to populations which typically may not be exposed to the arts. How did that tiptoe that line up then to working with incarcerated individuals and specifically then your Moving Beyond Bars project?
Well, over the years in different situations in cities that I've toured to, I've often reached out to try to engage organizations that I could do a workshop at. And so along the way, some number of years ago, I did some work at a prison out in California, and then I was invited to do a 2-week residency at a juvenile detention center in Miami, and then I did some work in Red Wing, Minnesota with juveniles. So I guess, over the years I've done different projects and programs with people who are dealing with incarceration. And that, I guess it came to a head a couple years ago. I'd been reading, you know what it was? I'll tell you what it was. I was in Alabama working, and I was working in Birmingham, but I went down to Montgomery to see what is called, sadly, the Lynching Museum, but the museum that follows the history of slavery. And it was incredibly, incredibly moving and really impactful. And then I came back to Birmingham, and there just so happened to be an exhibit in the gallery at the University of Alabama called Marking Time that was done by a woman named Nicole Fleetwood. And she's a person who's a sociologist, and she followed a number of incarcerated people who were doing art in prisons across the country. And she wrote a book, and then she also curated this exhibit, which was literally across the street in the theater I was working in. And it also was incredibly compelling. The difference is that all of the work in the Marking Time exhibit is contemporary, where the museum in Montgomery follows slavery from 200 years ago. But my sense was nothing's changed. It really goes to the new Jim Crow, right? That whole concept. But it was just chilling to see all the images in this exhibit. And it was just an echo of all of the images at the Slavery Museum. And I felt like I have to do more work in this area. It was so compelling to me. So that's really how I decided I'm gonna really make an effort, and I I wrote a grant to work in the South Dakota State Men's Penitentiary and collaborate with a friend of mine who's a visual artist. So we were there last year. It was funded by the National Endowment for the Arts, and we were there for a month. We were with the guys for 4 hours a day. She would work with them on painting and drawing skills. I'd work with them on writing and movement. And at the conclusion of that residency, we did about a 50-minute performance, actually, with a lot of monologues. And then she had a number of paintings that they'd created in a large painting. And that exhibit of work now is traveling to museums through South Dakota. And it's called Arts and Incarceration, I believe. The project we did at the prison was called, I believe, the South Dakota Prison Project. So now we're about to go to another prison in South Dakota in the spring. And then I've written another grant to hopefully do some work in Florida prison. So I'm kind of following this trajectory for myself because I don't know. I love it in the sense that it's completely teaching me it's teaching me. And in my art, I love to surround myself with things I don't know.
I applaud that sense of discovery, Suzanne. And as you were speaking about your experiences, it dawned on me sometimes in life we just have these sort of serendipity moments, as you talked about when you were seeing the Marking Time exhibit and sort of connecting those dots, and it's manifested itself in the deliverable that you have now. Mm-hmm. Talk about now, you've sort of refined this, and I know you've gone from California to South Dakota, even to Red Wing here in Minnesota, and I alluded to it. We might as well talk about it. You will be presenting at the World Congress of Probation and Parole, the 6th World Congress on Probation and Parole, which will be taking place in April of 2024 in The Hague over in the Netherlands. I, too, will be there presenting on our Innovative Tides model. So maybe give a preview or an abstract of what that presentation is going to be all about for our many listeners who I know for a fact will be joining us in The Hague. So give them a sneak preview, perhaps.
Right. So my proposal to the conference, and that was accepted, is to do an experiential workshop. I'm not interested in talking at people, frankly. My work as a movement artist is that we learn when we participate. So it'll be a participatory workshop. What I'm intending to do, in addition to sort of giving the contextual background of the project, I believe, the South Dakota Prison Project, and the other work I've done with incarcerated populations, is to talk about what I intend when I work with incarcerated populations. And here's the thing: I'm not a therapist. I'm not a dance therapist. I go in as an artist. However, that's not to say I don't know that it's therapeutic. I recognize that, and I know it can be very transformative, and I've witnessed it, many, many times. And what I concentrate on, both with this population and actually pretty much anybody I work with, is I enlist people to sort of go back in memory, and I'll give them a prompt to think of something, right? Something that maybe they haven't thought about for a while, and have them really embody that, in their memory, and then have them write about it in detail. And then eventually, from the writing, bring it into movement exploration. So it's going from a memory to being, transcribed to writing, being transcribed to movement. And I'll do that at the conference because it's better to do it than to talk about it. And I'll probably use maybe one of the prompts I've used with the incarcerated people that I've worked with. I'm imagining I will. But I think it will be definitely an experiential workshop. And I know, having gone to many conferences of all kinds, a lot of times it's sit down and listen, which is fine. But what happens, we know in the brain, is that we don't absorb very much when we're sitting still. So in movement arts, we understand that we take in more when actually we're applying it physically.
To your point, Suzanne, as much as I like to pride myself on a professional orator, you're right. The science shows that it's around 93%, 95% of what we verbally say to an audience isn't digested. It's what they see and what they do and what they feel and all of the above. Right. So I'm with you on making that experiential versus lecture-based. We know, and regular listeners of the podcast know, I talk about the phenomenon of desistance from crime quite a bit, which is, as you know, the process of exiting a life of crime. And we also know from that desistance research that a big variable in that desistance process is transforming one's identity. Mm-hmm. In your experience, Suzanne, how does creative expression through programs like your Moving Beyond Bars, how does that influence the identity and the self-perception of that justice-involved individual during their transformation rehabilitative process?
Well, I think it's interesting you should use the language identity, because in fact what I think I focus on is for me to validate each person's individual identity and to help them sort of, recapture it, let's say, and find a way to express it. Now, incarcerated populations, as you know, they've been stripped so much. They've been stripped so much of who they are. I mean, so have other populations, but we're talking about this right now. And so for me, to have them reclaim their name in the performance at South Dakota, one of the things we wrote about and then we incorporated in the performance was, what's the derivation of your name? Why are you named what you're named? Now, about 30% of my participants were Native, and so they had fabulous names, of course, but also, there's such a tradition in terms of Native populations and where their names come from. But everybody, as these guys wrote about it, it was like, oh yeah, my uncle was named this, and then I got that as my middle name, and it's reclaiming what that is. It's really reclaiming a piece of their identity, but it's something that maybe they haven't thought about for a while. Well, first of all, they're not referred to much by their name, right? Sometimes they're referred to by their last name, sometimes by a number. The person I was working with at the prison, I remember saying to her, well, is John, I'm just making up a name, but is John here today? Because who's John? She only knew them by their last name. She's been there 17 years. So, even that, I think, in a way, is like, recapturing your sense of identity through your birth-given name, where it came from, which, of course, then connects you to your familial ancestral history is, I think, pretty powerful. And, I also had them write a lot about, it was interesting in this recent project, I had them write about strength and serenity. And I was curious, because somewhat they're opposite and maybe they feed each other. And here I thought strength would be the easy thing for them to identify with, and it wasn't. Serenity was it was easier for them to capture and write about that. And a lot of it is, the taboos about you can't show too much strength. You only can show certain kinds of strength, where vulnerability lies, that sort of thing. But what was interesting is after I learned that, and they wrote about it and we shared that, I had them we created a really very physical movement section for them that was all about moving with strength, like really strong. And again, I think it was recapturing a part of themselves because they had to stuff it, right? Stuff it in a certain way. Ownership of the kind of strength that's positive. Do you know what I mean? It's not I can be a tough guy and beat up someone. Not that kind of strength. Inner strength. Where is my inner strength? And so for them, again, to be given permission, actually, to own that about themselves. I think again, Joe, I think all of this is actually about recapturing identity.
Yeah, it's fascinating, Suzanne. The more I learn about various core correctional skills, evidence-based practices, there's this crazy, as you alluded to, almost like interconnectedness or synergy with so many of these themes, and identity is one of those big ones. I loved what you're saying about strengths. We are trying to reshape how we deliver services in corrections and get away from this historically deficit-driven approach, whether it's risk assessment or skill deficits. Again, it's a very deficit-driven. But now when we train, it's almost, to your point, and you're doing this, encouraging that client to look for their strengths, to look for areas of resiliency, because historically, and you alluded to this too, but every interaction that a client has had with the justice system has been, in a sense, a degradation ceremony. Yeah. We're celebrating that individual's failures, whether it's their arrest or their conviction or their sentencing or their various probation violations that they're brought back before the court. It's a degradation ceremony. We're there to celebrate their failures. And it becomes so ingrained and conditioned, to your point, that it's almost alien to them to talk about strengths or what's good in their life or anything like that. I know I've dabbled with various desistance interventions, for lack of a better term. And some of them are simply as simple rather as, hey, just sit down and draw a picture or write a poem or write a song about your future crime-free self, your future sober self, what that looks like. But we know that just this notion of them almost visualizing it helps manifest that. And it gets out of that, again, playing whack-a-mole with these risk factors and empowering the individual. How have you, and it sounds like you've had a lot of experience working in the prisons, and I think change starts with small steps and one individual at a time. But as a former practitioner, what role do you see for that, whether it's the probation officer or corrections officer or other justice professional in sort of not necessarily implementing, but supporting more of an arts-based rehabilitation program?
Yeah, it's interesting because I've thought about this, and I thought about it in the same way that I have worked in healthcare where I've worked with patients and providers separately, but I've also worked with them in the same room. It really changes the power dynamic, right? When you have a physician and a med student, or a physician and a patient, or something, And I actually wanted to work with the COs at the prison in South Dakota. There was not a lot of enthusiasm about that. But I think a lot of work has to be done, because the work I've done with healthcare, which I've done for since 1992, I call it caring for the caregiver. It's really about having them sort of examine themselves and find ways to, refill their cup and all of that sort of thing. Well, I look at the people who are the staff in correctional facilities are caregivers. Now, they may not be the best kind, but they are running on empty a lot. And of course, we have scores of problems with not enough staffing and all of that. But even if it was staffed well, I don't think that there's a healthy environment for a lot of the people who are working as staff in these situations. So I actually think there's lots to be said about offering this same sort of thing, training for the people that work in prisons as well as the prisoners. But I also think, look at it, and I think this challenges so many norms that I don't know if it'll get there. But I've thought about this, about repositioning the sort of power dynamic. On some level, as you know, these guys in a men's prison, I'm talking about men, of course there's women prisons, but there's a relationship already. Sometimes it's almost equal. Right? Some of the prisoners said to me when I was working with them in the project, the COs say to us, we're the same thing. You just got caught, right? We're the same. And in a certain way, there's not a differentiation. And there's something to me that thinks, boy, if the recognition of commonality could be somehow embodied, I think it needs to be embodied, perhaps something would change. I know there's larger issues, in all of these situations. But I do think that there's something to be said about how we train our staff in these situations, because it's not healthy for them in many cases. That's why there's, at least right now, incredible turnover, or they can't even get people to come and do it. I think there's that. The other thing I think is that I'm big on teaching empathy in all my work. And I think that the thing about empathy, which I think is sadly lacking in our culture just in general, but is this concept of if we can other someone, it's much easier to not be kind to them, to disengage with them, all of these things. If we can be empathetic to somebody, or sympathetic, if not empathetic, I think that changes the dynamic, which is part of the reason I do the work I do. If people can hear the stories of incarcerated people, I know from the audience they're sobbing. I mean, I think it changes minds. If, COs and inmates can work together and hear each other's stories, I think it changes minds, because I think there's an empathy impact there. And so I think there's a lot to be done about that. Of course, it's like healthcare. It's such a huge, it's a monolith, right? So to make big changes, in the general structure is hard. But I always think I have to do my little steps. I do what I can in the way I can do it, and hopefully, it has some impact. But I do think, people were so moved by these guys' performance when we did it in April, the people that came, because they heard stories and they saw parts of these people that they had no idea, would have never imagined. And I think it breaks down barriers, which is why I feel like it's, for me, choosing the name Moving Beyond Bars is like, it's all of it. It's moving the story out from behind the bars. And also for the people that are, we talk about outside and inside when we work in prisons, to start getting rid of that divide, the outside-inside divide. But again, for me, I think I'm working towards, providing some pathway to empathy, because I think that's really a key thing in terms of making change.
It is the key thing, or one of the key things. As you spoke, it reminded me of an expression that, I don't know if my colleague coined it, but we use it all the time. Folks have heard of, for example, racism and sexism. We often talk about the fact that in corrections, there's otherism. It's like, well, those other people, they're standoff. They're not like us. They're the others. And it's no different, like I said, than racism or sexism or ageism. But as you said, tearing down those walls and getting at those commonalities is key. There's a big trend. I was doing some training in Europe, and I see over there that they lean a lot more into this notion of perspective taking, which we do here in the States as well, but they really lean into it. And the fact that if you can, obviously without, with keeping the professional relationship in place and not disclosing personal information, but any type of perspective sharing between the practitioner and the client will move that needle immensely. I was told a story by my friend, Professor Dernescu from the University of Bucharest. He shared a story of a practitioner in Romania that had a client that consistently struggled showing up on time for appointments, and tried all the motivational interviewing and the this and that. And finally, at one point, just out of semi-frustration, flat out asked, "Why are you always late for these appointments?" And the client, a little bit sheepishly at first, acknowledged, I have a child with autism, and the special needs bus that they have to get on picks them up late, and it conflicts with these appointments that you always set for me early morning. Well, the practitioner, the probation officer, decided to make a leap of faith and shared the fact that I have an autistic son as well. Yeah. And that totally changed the dynamic moving forward. It totally changed the relationship. It totally took out that power differential that you spoke of, that otherism type thing. I'm not saying you need to, if you're a practitioner, maybe go to that extreme, but sharing something along the lines of, I like ice fishing too, or I come a big family too. Something that you're not this sort of machine that is just there to catch you doing wrong. But no, I'm a relatable person too.
Right.
Oh, Suzanne, I could talk to you forever. I can't wait till we connect over in the Netherlands. Let me ask you this. I don't know the answer to the question necessarily, but I talked about evidence-based practices earlier. Can you share any research or evidence that highlights the effectiveness of arts and movement programs in rehabilitation of clients or any population for that matter?
Well, it's interesting. We had someone join us to do some research when we did this project last spring in South Dakota. We saw things like 15% decrease in depression. We saw an increase in a sense of people feeling like they had belonged to a community, so that isolationism that happens in prison really was somewhat alleviated for these guys. I think the other thing, which might sound negative, but it's also kind of positive, is that they were really disappointed that staff didn't come and support them when they did their performance. They didn't come. And so, again, that disconnect between who they're living amidst all the time, right, wasn't there. But there's a really wonderful book that's out, called Your Brain on Art by two researchers from Johns Hopkins. And they're really, it's really about something called neuroaesthetics. And it's following how the brain and the body is literally impacted. It's very evidence-based, impacted by participating in artistic activities. And one of the things that it's just sort of a, little takeaway, but, they say that participating in one activity a month can extend your life by 10 years. Okay, so it's sort of like, it's about looking at why art is beneficial for your wellness, why art is important for your, your sense of self and your sense of finding meaning, but also that it actually impacts your brain in very physical ways in your body as a result. And I think, the more that we have work like that to sort of back up, for those of us that are in the arts, we're so used to people feeling like, we're doing a hobby, we're dilettantes, isn't that nice, all that kind of thing. However, for those of us who have been doing it a long time, and those of us that choose to engage populations in art making, we understand the power of it. We know, we get it, we know. I mean, whether it's chronicled or in a white paper or not, we know that art has incredible impact. Now, it used to be called, soft evidence or, whatever, because it's qualitative. And so sometimes that's hard to capture. You may not get numbers as much as that person's like totally different. But for instance, it's interesting. Just this week, I was in South Dakota again because we're touring this art exhibit that came out of the prison project. But then I went to the prison just to have a short meeting. And it turns out, now I can't say that this is because of the project, but I can't say it's not. So that project was last April. We're there for the month. And then we went back in June and they performed it again. And I would say when I was checking in our cast, about 35% have either been transferred to, the prison in Sioux Falls is considered medium maximum security, right? So about 35% have been transferred either to a different prison, which is a medium security prison, or released. Now, I can't say that's because of us, but I can't say it's not. Like, I don't know. Maybe those guys would have gotten transferred anyway. Maybe they would have gotten released anyway. But I also think, like, they had such a sense of self and sense of self of, pride in themselves, I think maybe it made a difference, in their behavior. And I can't say that we captured that in any kind of research, although as we move forward, we're going to try to do that. But I do think it has that kind of impact.
Along those lines, Suzanne, I've learned over the years to let go of the sort of stranglehold that I used to have on quote unquote evidence-based practices. And to your point, be a little bit more patient and a little bit more understanding of things that might be evidence informed, let's say, before they become, hardcore meta-analysis, efficacy, blah, blah, blah. Because I found that it became it was almost prohibitive that we're setting the standard so high that it's got to be this hardcore evidence base that you didn't allow these emerging things, and this is so true in the desistance field as well, to really take root, if you will, and flourished. And when you were talking about the neuroscience, again, I can't wait to connect offline with you, Suzanne, because the TIDES model, which is our trauma-informed desistance model that my colleague Nicole Kimberly Staley and I will be presenting on in The Hague, is heavily anchored in neuroscience awareness and that hard wiring, which I look at that as sort of a validation of what we've been talking about earlier, as far as we're all hardwired the same. We're all humans. We all have that same neuroplasticity and that ability to change those pathways, whether it's through art or the approaches we take in our TIDES model. It's sort of an all of the above approach. Suzanne, on the flip side, and again, the good news is you've had the opportunity to travel to a variety of correctional facilities, and we know the devil's in the details when it comes to implementation. But what have been some of the bigger challenges that you've encountered while implementing your arts program in correctional facilities, and how have you addressed those when they've popped up?
The challenges are many. And I'd say the largest barrier to doing this regularly is that, in fact, at least in prisons in the United States, programming is not very valued. I mean, there's just not a lot of, can we bring in something that would be, rehabilitative and informative and expressive. And, so there's just sort of already like the door is not even open in a certain sense. So I sort of have to bring it kind of funded, like here we are, and please, can somebody just believe it enough to take us in? I mean, it sounds crazy, but I know California is somewhat the exception. I have a number of colleagues that work in prisons out in California, and what I understand is that they have a line item on the Department of Corrections, a budget for programming, and I think that makes a huge difference, right? And I think, as you know, because you've been all over the world, but I think European incarceration is very different. Again, because I think there's it's about reintegration. It's about reform, and if you're about that, you're going to be looking at all these different ways, and arts is going to be one of them, right? Because arts is emotional and physical and behavioral and all those things. But if you're not looking at if you're not looking at reform, then you don't really care. So I would say that's my largest challenge. But it doesn't matter. I keep knocking at the door and keep, writing grants to fund it. I think the other thing is I going back to staffing, and again, you've had much more experience than I have, but I will say that if I just was to draw a picture of the physical impression of staff often when I'm in these situations, it's arms folded, face frozen, I'm not participating. You know what I mean? It's like every possible barrier to being engaged. And so that hard line between staff and the other people, it just, it's like if you go into a school, I've worked in schools, so for many years, I mean, if I work in a classroom and the teacher's correcting papers, that's one thing. If I go in a classroom and the teacher's up and doing the stuff with me with the kids, that says something else, right? So it's just hugely communicative if the person's involved. I mean, so I think that's a problem. And I think the other thing is I think that in general, our country, I'm making broad statements here, but this is my impression as a person that's not, a professional in the correctional field. This is a population that, frankly, nobody really wants to know about. It's why we build prisons out out as far away as possible, where we don't see them. If you're driving on a long distance trip, you happen to go by it, but otherwise, we don't want to know. We don't want to know. We want them far away. Please don't tell me unless, I have somebody that's by chance incarcerated. I don't want to know about it. So, if we've got a population in our country that nobody wants to know about, boy, you got to work really hard to find, some support to provide them with something that might be beneficial. So I think, those are my biggest challenges.
Well, let's try to address some of those challenges, maybe one listener at a time. I like to think I've got more of a progressive audience, not just here in the States, but we've mentioned Europe and even down in Australia. So how could a professional in the field of corrections, advocate for and support the inclusion of creative programs in client reintegration?
Well, what's common in prisons in our country are religious programs, right? And nothing against that. It's fine, right? And it's often volunteer-based. So, it's not professionals coming in. It's people that are out of the goodness of their heart are coming in. But if we just said, okay, if we've got 4 religious programs, let's have 4 creative programs. Because all of this is about tending to someone's spirituality, their personhood, their identity, their sense of strength, their sense of being a better person. If we could just align creative programming with spiritual programming, which I think the arts does feed the spirit, without a particular theology about it, I think that would be not a very difficult thing to do. And I think it would be, I think we'd see results, we'd see evidence-based results,
Yeah, that's a good point. It's more about, as you said, aligning existing capacity than reinventing the entire wheel and showing more of those commonalities around the approaches we're already taking. I can tell you, Suzanne, just from the last 40 minutes of talking to you, you've mentioned identity I don't know how many times, and I can tell you that's one of the 4 pillars of our TIDES model, along with resiliency, which I know kind of feeds into what we're talking about here, and that, that personal growth. Another pillar is that of social support, which of course comes from being part of a community, whether it's an arts community or any other community. So yeah, a lot of commonalities here. What are some emerging trends or innovations rather, Suzanne, that you foresee in this sort of intersection of arts and client rehabilitation? Maybe look into your crystal ball. Let's say we're back on the show here in 5 years. What am I going to be talking to Suzanne about?
Well, it's interesting. I was talking about this with someone the past few days, and I'm part of an organization. It's a national organization called Justice Arts Coalition. It's based out in the D.C. area, but and it's fairly new. It's probably about 4 years old. But we had a virtual conference last year. I think there were 200 people. These are artists all over the country doing hip hop, with incarcerated populations in the Bronx, and doing writing things, like every kind of art form all over the country. And to just see that many people, on camera and talking about their programs that they do. And, for most of us, it's not the only thing we do because unfortunately we wouldn't sustain ourselves. But to see the breadth of the work, and I thought to myself, why maybe, not that we haven't been, some artists I know have been doing this for a while, but why is this maybe coming out of the shadows? And here's my theory, but I'm not sure I believe it. But I was just trying to figure out, why finally maybe are we creeping out of the shadows and willing to look at our sort of incarceration system? I think somewhat all the shootings ending with George Floyd, not that it ended there, but, it kind of worked its way up to having such a national impact. And looking at the discord, and then from there looking at, who gets shot? Who ends up in our prisons? I think in a way it enlarged the national cinema about this issue in a way that maybe people hadn't really known before. And I think maybe the conversation got spurred because of, Black Lives Matter, all the things around it that have happened. And I'm wondering if maybe, and then like this incredible art show marking time, and then, there's some films that are happening, and of course Bard College has been doing, College Behind Bars for a while, but I just think there's a groundswell a little bit, especially in the arts community, to sort of like, let's not look away. Let's not look away anymore. Let's look in and see, let's bring, and artists, for forever, for all eternity, have always been the people that look at things and see things maybe before other people notice them, right? Bring some awareness to the things in our civilization. So I think maybe that's what's happening. And I hope if we were going to come back in 5 years that, boy, it would be like, do you remember when we talked and there wasn't, that much going on, and now look at this? I mean, that would be fabulous to me.
I agree, Suzanne. I think for a lot of factors, some of which you just articulated, there really is a seismic shift going on in corrections and really reviewing even our so-called evidence-based practices and looking at more and more approaches to take somewhat of a all-hands-on-deck approach and looking for those partners that we haven't historically looked to, whether it's the arts or even, and again, regular listeners of the show know I love having folks on with lived experiences. But for example, just this notion that for historically at least, the inclusion of someone who's justice involved, it was taboo, which it's just crazy. I mean, it's like going down to the Mayo Clinic here in Minnesota and talking to the doctors and the scientists and the researchers. And the last thing they ever do, though, is talk to the patients, right? I mean, it's just insane to think of it. But yeah, I think there's a lot of exciting, fun things going on right now. Indeed, the aforementioned World Congress, if I'm not mistaken, their overall theme this year is the future of probation and parole, which I'm relatively certain is why folks like you and I were invited to come and speak to that worldwide audience, which I'm so excited about. Suzanne Costello, Moving Beyond Bars. I'm glad we connected. And again, I want to talk to you offline about a variety of things, and I'm confident we'll have you back on the show more than 5 years from now. In the meantime, be well. I will see you in the Netherlands, and thank you so much for being a guest on the Criminologist podcast.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Bye-bye, Suzanne.
Bye-bye.
And that brings us to the close of another enriching and inspiring episode of the Criminologist podcast. Our deepest gratitude goes to Suzanne Costello for joining us today and sharing her incredible journey and the transformative power of her work in the realms of dance, theater, and community engagement. Suzanne's dedication to using the arts as a tool for healing, rehabilitation, and giving voice to the often voiceless segments of our society is truly remarkable. We are also excited to remind our listeners that both Suzanne and I are honored to have been invited to present on our respective projects at the prestigious 6th World Congress on Probation and Parole, which will be held in The Hague in April of 2024. This is a testament to the impact and importance of our work in the fields of criminal justice and community rehabilitation. For those who are intrigued by Suzanne's groundbreaking initiatives and wish to learn more, we have included links in the show notes of this podcast. These resources provide a deeper insight into her projects and her significant impact. We highly encourage you to explore these links and discover the profound ways in which Suzanne's work is contributing to societal change and individual healing. As we wrap up, I want to thank you, our listeners, for joining us on this journey of exploration and discovery. Your engagement and interest in these crucial topics are what drives us to bring forward such inspiring stories and insights. Remember to stay tuned for more episodes where we continue to delve into the fascinating and complex world of criminology, rehabilitation, and justice. We will be back next week with a fresh episode. In the meantime, you may contact the show or reach out to us through our website, the Paragon Group, LLC.com, for training or presentations as to core correctional skills, desistance from crime, or, of course, our innovative TIDES model. If you have questions or comments as to this podcast, feel free to contact the show via our email at thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. That's thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. Remember to follow us through our Facebook and Instagram pages at The Criminologist Podcast. New fun images are being added all the time to those feeds. You don't want to miss out. We are also on X. Give us a follow at Crim Media Group. That's CRIM Media Group. You may also connect with me, Joseph Arvidson, on LinkedIn and follow both the Criminologist Podcast and the Paragon Group on our LinkedIn pages. Hey, lastly, if you've not already done so, check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminologist, for additional content as to the themes of this podcast. And if you believe in what we're doing on the show, if you're part of the movement, please spread the word, tell a friend or a coworker or a colleague about us, ask them to subscribe to the podcast, and of course, do so yourself if you've not already done so. And always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us.
And then have them write about it in detail, and then eventually from the writing, bring it into movement exploration. So it's going from a memory to being, transcribed to writing, being transcribed to movement. And I'll do that at the conference because it's better to do it than to talk about it.
The Criminologist Podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, or training opportunities, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. If you enjoyed the show, you can find more content and videos on our YouTube channel, The Criminologist. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Both the Criminologist Podcast and the Criminologist channel are brought to you by the Criminologist Media Group. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.